Welcome to the Sense Making in a Changing World podcast, where we explore the kind of thinking we need to navigate a positive way forward. I'm your host, Morag, permaculture educator and global ambassador, filmmaker, eco-villager, food forester, mother, practivist, and all-round lover of thinking, communicating, and acting regeneratively. For a long time, it's been clear to me that to shift trajectory to a thriving one-planet way of life, we first need to shift our thinking. The way we perceive ourselves in relation to nature, self, and community is the core. So this is true now more than ever, and even the way change is changing. Unprecedented changes are happening all around us at a rapid pace. So how do we make sense of this? To know which way to turn, to know what action to focus on, so our efforts are worthwhile and nourishing and are working towards resilience, regeneration, and reconnection. What better way to make sense than to join together with others in open, generative conversation? In this podcast, I'll share conversations with my friends and colleagues, people who inspire and challenge me in their ways of thinking, connecting, and acting. These wonderful people are thinkers, doers, activists, scholars, writers, leaders, farmers, educators, people whose work informs permaculture and spark the imagination of what a post-COVID, climate-resilient, socially just future could look like. Their ideas and projects help us to make sense in this changing world, to compost and digest the ideas, and to nurture the fertile ground for new ideas, connections, and actions. Together we'll open up conversations in the world of permaculture design, regenerative thinking, community action, earth repair, eco-literacy, and much more. I can't wait to share these conversations with you. Over the last 3 decades of personally making sense of the multiple crises we face, I always return to the practical and positive world of permaculture, with its ethics of earth care, people care, and fair share. I've seen firsthand how adaptable and responsive it can be in all contexts, from urban to rural, from refugee camps to suburbs. It helps people make sense of what's happening around them and to learn accessible design tools to shape their habitat positively and to contribute to cultural and ecological regeneration. This is why I've created the Permaculture Educators program, to help thousands of people to become permaculture teachers everywhere through an interactive online dual certificate of permaculture design and teaching. We sponsor global perma-youth programs, women's self-help groups in the global south, and teens in refugee camps. So anyway, this podcast is sponsored by the Permaculture Education Institute and our Permaculture Educators program. If you'd like to find more about permaculture, I've created a 4-part permaculture video series to explain what permaculture is and also how you can make it your livelihood as well as your way of life. We'd love to invite you to join our wonderfully inspiring, friendly and supportive global learning community. So I welcome you to share each of these conversations, and I'd also like to suggest you create a local conversation circle to explore the ideas shared in each show and discuss together how this makes sense in your local community and environment. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I meet and speak with you today, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. In this episode of Sense Making in a Changing World, it's my honour and delight to be speaking with a giant in the world of design, positive design. Professor Janis Birkeland has dedicated her professional, her academic and her personal life to figuring out what is genuine social and ecological sustainability and how we can work towards it. She was drawn to exploring the reimagining of the design of our cities, the places where we work and where we live, and she sees that as essential to exploring this question. She first became an architect and urban designer and then transferred into city planning, and then became a lawyer too to better understand the barriers to systems change. She has originated the theory of NetPositive Development and Design. She's the author of many books, including Positive Development, Design for Sustainability, and more recently, NetPositive Design and Sustainable Urban Development, which includes an app, as well as over 100 papers too. I'll put the links in the notes below. She's been a professor of architecture at QUT in Brisbane, a professor of sustainable architecture at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, and is now an honorary professor at the University of Melbourne. Together we explore ways to rethink how to design human settlements for one planet living, and in ways that enhance and regenerate, not destroy the places they're in. I hope you enjoy this conversation. It was such a great opportunity to get back together with Janis and to explore these really important questions. Welcome to the show, Janis. It's an absolute delight to see you again, and thank you for taking the time to be here today. I wanted to open up our conversation.
Lovely to see you again.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to open up our conversation. You've been working your entire professional life and probably even interested in it before you started working professionally in it. But what motivates you about trying to do something about thinking differently about how we're living on this planet? What is it that started you to head on this journey?
Well, first of all, when I was a young child, I was exposed to nature and enjoyed everything about nature, really, just the infinite complexity. It's a miracle. And I found out that wilderness would be probably gone within my lifetime if things continued the way they were. So that would have been the early 50s. I had been a butterfly collector and had to give it up because I realized one of the insects I caught was bordering on extinction. So later on, I was teaching green design, well, throughout the 1970s, 1990s. And I had a break in about 2000 or 2001, so I published my teaching materials as a textbook. And when it was at the publishers, I stopped to think that there's all these new ideas and so many people getting involved in sustainability issues, but it was futile because even if we build terribly green buildings, they're still usually doing more harm than no building at all because of the material flows and damage, and simply landscaping this site and adding a green roof didn't begin to compensate for the upstream and downstream impacts. So that's I had a little bit of time and decided that buildings and cities could have net positive impacts, as incredible as that sounds, because of the huge impacts. But it's for that very reason. Buildings touch on every sustainability issue you can think of. I think even war and peace, because if you segregate people from their basic needs and basic opportunities by sectioning them off in poor regions or poor parts of cities, you're fomenting resentment, insecurity, and social strife. So there's really nothing you can think of related to sustainability that isn't influenced by the design of cities and buildings. And as many people have said and were saying since the 70s, really, less bad is not really sustainable from a whole system perspective. And sustainability is a whole system issue. You can't just say a building's sustainable within its property lines or its building envelope. And people are still saying that. Mm-hmm. You have building tools that will say they're net positive because they're generating energy and shipping it across a property line. But that means nothing if the final use of that energy is for something socially or ecologically harmful or simply wasteful. So you have to look at whole systems. And all our tools, our principles, our strategies are based on simply what's easy to measure. So we apply input-output analysis, or basically arithmetic. Green building rating tools have trouble dealing with embodied energy. So they just make up rules about how much square percentage of your roof should be green, or how much of your facade should have a living wall, or, pretty arbitrary little rules that are based on what would be an improvement over a typical building. So they're not really looking at sustainability. And when they do adopt terms like nature positive or net positive, they use them incorrectly. Maybe I should let you.
No, that's great. That's a fantastic introduction, because I think my next question was going to be, well, how is it that you describe net positive? And you also have this term, what was it called? A positive ecological footprint. So we're familiar with this idea of our ecological footprint, or the ecological footprint studies that have been done. But what does it mean to have a positive ecological footprint and use net positive in your framing? Like, what's the paradigm shift that you see that we need to be having in this realm?
Well, I maybe should start with the definition. Net positive has to be both nature positive and socially positive. And the simple definition is that a building or city could increase the ecological base, which is just my term for all things nature, because, you want to include biodiversity and ecosystems, healthy environments, and so on. But rather than just increasing them compared to what we've done in the past or what we consider best practice, really needs to be beyond pre-settlement conditions. And that's because we're in a huge deficit. We've increased the population beyond human, let alone biodiversity, ecological carrying capacity. We've increased pollution. We're still adding pollutants to the environment and not even knowing how they interact with each other. And of course, we're increasing consumption. Consumption's linked to population, but it's not, if we had less people, we would still have unsustainable systems. That being the case, we've got to increase nature in absolute terms. And whenever I say that, people think I mean cleaning up nature, remediation, restoration, not increasing it in relation to pre-settlement, pre-urban, or pre-industrial conditions, which exact measure you use would depend on what you're talking about. And that's number one, increasing the ecological base. Number two is, I call it increasing the public estate. And that means all things community, fairness, equity, justice. And in that case, pre-industrial conditions would not be a good standard, but I say beyond current regional conditions. So green buildings really just talk about equity and justice among building stakeholders. Healthier occupants, not healthier neighbors in most cases, or healthier workers. Those, of course, are important, but we need public benefits. Building transfers resources in many cases to private parties. huge amounts of material flows are being accumulated by those of us that are lucky enough to have our own homes or work in huge office buildings if we're corporations. That's transferring resources to private parties. The antidote to that, since we're living in a capitalist society, is design, because design can create features that not only benefit the building occupants, but benefit the public as a whole. And so it's conceivable to have net public benefits through multifunctional design. Now, it's not just multifunctional design. It's also got to be adaptable. A lot of traditional green buildings focus on durability. And they don't mean parts that last a long time. They mean structures that you can't change to meet new climates, new technologies, or new uses. Now we're gradually moving towards more adaptable, modular design concepts. There's all kinds of changes going on in all parts of the industry. But basically, we're not designing for adaptability. And we're also not using quickly enough all the new products that are coming online that are not only nature-based, but very low impact in that they use less, they not only damage land less, as we have in forestry, mining, and agriculture, but can actually be grown on a lot less land. And ideally, one day, those materials could return land to the environment, to nature, rather than just to industrial uses alone.
What are some of those materials that you're talking about, Janis?
Well, there are new mycelium-based structural products such as wall panels, insulation, and even boards, and whole structures have been built out of them, and they're coming online. Now, these mushrooms, so the simple term in a sense, can sequester waste, carbon, other kinds of things. They can be strong, or they can be infill materials, but there are mushroom-based bricks that have been used. The beauty of these things is that they can be grown in low-impact vertical factories. They don't take much space. You don't have, hemp is a very good product, and whole houses from the concrete to the boards have been made entirely from hemp. But you still have to have a lot of agricultural land. And there's a lot of materials made from agri-waste, which is fine if it's a byproduct of an essential crop or something. But it does take up land, and in that sense, it's destructive. Now, buildings are really compilations of products and a lot of fabrics. And furniture, in the past at least, the material flows that went into furniture that's changed over so many times when new owners move in, particularly in office buildings, that the material flows are greater than in the building itself over its lifetime.
Wow.
Studies have claimed. And fabrics can now be made from algae. So it's another example. So you could call those nature-based materials. And of course, more ecocentric design. To give you an example, a building that's designed to contain permanent gardens and trees can have just as much space for people, but can sequester more carbon over its lifespan than it emitted over its whole lifespan. Mm-hmm. And I and a couple of associates wrote a paper on that some years back. The work was mainly by David Midmore, an agronomist who did the figures. But it has been shown, and people, when they look at something like that, they sort of dismiss it and say, oh, well, that would be planting is temporary. Well, not necessarily. Permanent planting that's continually upcycled can live as long as a building does, certainly. And you don't just have to have green walls, you can have what I call green scaffolding, which is three-dimensional environment that's either the wall structure itself that's added onto the wall in places where it's appropriate, that's part of fencing, or on the roof. So, it's just creating ecosystem enclaves that also provide building services. So green scaffolding is a way of designing for ecosystem services that increase the biophilic amenities of the living environment, improve the views, create living wallpaper, produce clean air and water and passive solar features, but also are efficient and recyclable in the old sense of green building. I mean, it can do anything because this scaffolding can be designed for multiple purposes. It can collect and store energy. It can collect and treat water through natural systems. It certainly can produce biodiversity and even provide biodiversity incubators for particular butterflies that are rare in the area, or food sources and nesting places for birds that are endangered. So the potential is literally infinite, much like nature.
So when you're saying that really that the cities have that possibility of restoring the problems that we're facing, the paradox of that. And I wonder, as you're talking, I'm imagining, I could start to see it in my mind, and I'm imagining this both being something that you're talking about as a retrofit at the same time as any new builds. How do you see transforming the middle of, dense cities that exist in the world today? How does this relate? Could it relate in somewhere like Seoul, for example?
Well, it could, but I think the first place you would start is not the business hub of a large city, but the perimeter areas that are generally degraded, old abandoned factories and warehouses that could become and have been used to support urban agriculture, which of course is one of the essential ways of returning land to nature. urban agriculture, of course, saves transport, provides food in an emergency, which we seem to be having more of, and it just uses space efficiently, and it's producing oxygen, recycling water, doing lots of other good things. So that would be the place to start. And of course, homes can be retrofitted. Buildings and homes can save money, so the retrofit can pay for itself. And we've known that for decades. It's been proven, but and there are companies, energy retrofit companies, that will reduce your energy bill at no cost to yourself. This has happened even when I was at the University of Canberra in the 1990s. An energy contractor came in and upgraded the buildings in very simple ways with better lighting. They paid themselves out of the savings. So the university did not have to spend any money. And in the end of the process, they inherited a lower energy bill. But unfortunately, they're only looking at energy and picking the lowest fruit. Like once you change all the light bulbs, then you don't have that spare savings to create multifunctional benefits instead of just reducing negative impacts. So that's kind of a shame. I complained about that in the 1990s, in fact. So it's all pretty old news. But if you have to retrofit cities if you want to be sustainable, because they're doing so much harm, and the retrofits could pay for themselves and create better jobs, and it can all happen at once. You can virtually be retrofitting every building, although there might be supply and demand issues for sustainable materials and energy efficient equipment and the like. So, but I like the idea that you could be like ants, cooperating and building the perfect anthill that's solar powered and air conditioned through natural systems, where everyone that wants to hire someone to retrofit their home can be doing something simultaneously. And there are a lot of products that I call them retrofitting modules that have multiple benefits that could just simply be added on to roofs in your typical suburb. Or you could add, if you wanted to increase the density of a suburb rather than replacing it with really unpleasant apartment buildings, you might want, or for some reason that's politically infeasible, you could add a second story to virtually every house, which becomes a grandma unit or a rental unit or a place for unemployed young children, older children. And in doing that addition, you're solarizing both units. You're not increasing transport significantly. Most suburban houses already have roads and enough parking spaces. So you can see a real boost to the economy while making things better in the short term. And the next stage might be to add these units in backyards, but that increase the overall biodiversity of the home. So there are many, many solutions, but they all require design thinking, not reductionism, where you try to get the most efficient single purpose, single function item. Is often not very efficient because it only serves one purpose.
There was a few things that were coming out of there that I wanted to jump in and ask you, but I might just ask you as a three question, and then wherever that goes to. So the first one was about, I'm interested to hear that you're talking about a really good starting point is around the edges. So around the suburbs and the peri-urban areas seems to be kind of a sweet spot for starting. Mm-hmm. And whereas often we're sort of focusing on, the inner section or the densification in the inner ring, whereas actually it's this outer ring of cities that possibly holds a lot of potential. That was sort of one question. The other part of it was thinking about, what is your overarching metaphor, perhaps, of how you think about a city? Is it city as forest, city as ecosystem, like as a way of imagining it differently? So rather than it being a build, yeah.
The metaphor I have always used, in fact, is that a city should be like a reef.
Like a what, sorry?
Like a reef, R-E-E-F.
Oh, a reef, right.
That, or a mangrove that seeds the ocean, that provides habitat for little biodiversity that can then restore the bioregions. So that's my metaphor. The first question, the other reason I wouldn't start with, you can retrofit tall buildings, and it's been done. You can put cladding of solar cells. And there are examples of buildings that have either been designed for solar energy or have even been retrofitted for solar energy. The thing about downtown glassy areas, I call them gilded cages. I don't think they're good for people. I can't work really in a city, in a downtown area. I've thought about it. They might be fun to visit, but they're extraordinarily unhealthy. But some people like them, and we should have choice. And we can afford to have shiny, new, metallic areas in cities for those that want it. Of course, solar powered, but, people shouldn't all have to live one way. My parents, for example, grew up on farms, and neither of them liked nature. They wanted to be in a nice, comfortable home that was devoid of nature, or particularly bugs and mice, So, and I respect that. Some people like ultra high density living, and that has some efficiency advantages, but again, it's single function because it can't be ecologically sustainable in itself. But zoning is reasonable as long as you're compensating for those deadly high rises somewhere else. And again, they can be generators of energy and efficiency. There's a lot of things that high density areas can't do. But as you say, the peri-urban areas can be retrofitted to supply what's missing in those inner city areas.
If we're getting a long-term shift, do you think there's a swing to outer areas again happening now? Is it just like a short phase, or do you see this as a long-term trend that might happen? Because I know that everyone's the cities are kind of emptying out quite a bit.
Well, I don't know, but I think a lot of people are attributing that to the cost and time involved in transport, and of course, COVID. People are beginning to appreciate the outdoors a lot more now that they've been locked in. But I think change will continue. There's going to be demographic shifts in the future, and that's why we have to be more adaptable. We let nice urban areas, like the town I grew up in, were allowed to degrade and become almost in places like slums because big new shopping centers were built on prime agricultural land that could only be reached by cars. That's changing. There's now more gentrification at the same time, an outward migration. So I think it's just essential to design every environment to benefit the general public and nature, not just the owners and the site alone.
One of the questions that I was reading that you'd had a very long time ago, and obviously a continuing one, was about like where that change happens and how systems change happens. So we've been talking about the kinds of change that we'd like to see, but what are those? I'm not going to say levers, because where is it that change takes place, or where is it that you feel that the shift needs to happen in order for this to be something that is seen everywhere?
Well, I've been concerned about governance. Positive development is really a theory about whole systems. And although it's focused on design, which has been so underrepresented in our culture, it's about changing systems of governance and decision-making. And I think one of the reasons that the green movement hasn't progressed too far is that it's only been focused on changing people. So everyone's trying to convert everyone else. That's perfectly good. I'm not knocking that. But when you only do that, you're always going to be trumped by dirty politics. A movement builds and everyone's advocating sustainability. And then you have the Brundtland Report, which I think quite innocently pulled the rug out of from under the movement. It was starting to build up again. And then you have Rio, and suddenly it's government controlling, and again, probably with the best of intentions, controlling community participation. So I think trying to change people individually, you can only change people on a one-on-one basis, that's true. But focusing on changing others is pretty short term, and it's not changing systems. I think it's also tending to ask hardworking people to do all the work while we go around preaching that they should think differently and be more like us. When I worked in government, I pointed out that they were in the promotions department. The environment education unit was in the promotions department. public relations. And they were trying to educate people to do what environmental groups were already educating people to do. So they were just repeating what others were doing voluntarily at great personal sacrifice. And I said, well, only governments can change systems. Basically, I just got, I think, blank looks, like that's too hard. I don't know what you're talking about. And after I left, I ran into someone who was still there, and I said, well, has anything changed since I was there? And they said, oh, yes, we're now back into changing people, as opposed to talking about systems. So I also I like to argue, but I don't really care what people think. If they don't believe in climate change, that's fine with me. I only care about not what they're doing as an individual, because they can't really change anything. I try to live well. I have my solar cells and battery and my rainwater tanks and so on, but it makes no difference in the bigger scheme of things. So I've always been interested in systems design, and you can't decide your way or choose your way into a new system. You have to design it, because you can't choose something that's not there already. And all our systems of policy making and decision making just rely on better choices, because we don't, and we say, oh, innovators will take care of that. It doesn't happen that way. Let me give you an example. I went to a conference where someone got up and bragged that they were going to build the biggest building in the Southern Hemisphere. And someone else raised the question and said, well, what about sustainability, not just bigness? And the guy said, oh, the market will take care of that. We're getting much better design. Well, this developer was the market. So, we can't just sort of say design will solve the problem, or technology will come along and fix everything. It's not really about technology. Design is quite different. Technology has generally been about efficiency. Design is about multifunctional use of structures and spaces in ways that meet the needs of nature and people. Or let's say NetPositive design would be, good design would be.
So where is that then? So it's not in the people. So where are you talking about this change being? You're talking about it being in governments, in policy. What happens if you have a bad government like now?
No, well, there may not be such a thing as a good government. I'm saying it's a design problem, and as a society, we're not looking at design. A lot of people have never even thought about it. They think design is a subset of decision making. One thing I've pointed out, I've always said design is a different way of thinking that's sort of not the same at all, but analogous to the right and left brain. I don't want to say that design is right brain, decision making is left brain, or anything like that, because design and decision making both require both sides of the brain. But it's an analogy. And throughout history, for various reasons, we've focused on decision-making and measurement. So we've never measured, our current tools cannot measure net positive design or net positive environments. That's where our building rating tools just make up rules. that industry will accept as a target. We prioritize arithmetic over sustainability. So we make up tools and systems for things we know how to measure. And the example I used before, we didn't know how to measure embodied energy in a building because material flows and life cycle analysis are pretty complicated. You have to have a finished design usually before you can apply one of these assessment tools. So that's why some certification companies will now use the term net positive, but they're only meaning good. Good is not net positive. They're only they talk about reductions in damage. They started calling them positive. And then later they heard the term net positive, so they started calling reductions in damage as net positive, meaning we're making an improvement in something, but it's not in a whole system sense an improvement.
So are we talking about design in city design, community design, home, like at what scale are we exploring?
Well, design is a way of thinking that's more creative and creating something that hasn't existed before. So we need to design systems of governance. That was my PhD thesis back in the 80s, was designing a system of governance that could take into account the environment. Now, where I am at today, or a couple of years, well, actually years ago, I designed a tool for measuring net positive design and development, but I couldn't do an app because I'm generationally challenged. So a year or two ago, I put out a net positive design app that's completely the reverse of all rating tools. So it's a design tool, but it can simultaneously assess the impact based not on typical buildings, but on environmental conditions or social conditions. So you're not comparing something to existing practices or how much better it is than a degraded site. You're comparing it to natural conditions and regional social conditions. And it's fun because it has sliders where you can estimate the impacts in the beginning. Later on, you can refine the impacts. And this whole digital diagram, it's a fractal diagram, all will change before your eyes. And the idea is that it stimulates design thinking because it reminds you that you're not just trying to improve water, but you can use that water to create several functions, and you can create several design elements to improve the quality of the water, or make it more suitable for biodiversity, not just people, and so on. So the design app is a tool. I also developed planning analyses. So many planners are pretty good. They all know what sustainability is, unlike many architects until recently. But they didn't have analyses that were very relevant to sustainability. So positive development has about 22 analyses that planners can apply. Either a community group can think about it as a as a mind mapping exercise, or planners could measure it with sophisticated new tools, you know, flyby, well, even satellite imagery or whatever is increasingly available. But this set of tools shows that we really haven't been analyzing development in ways that are really relevant to net positive impacts. So positive development is a theory that basically says everything we're doing in sustainability has been backwards. And by reversing those approaches from top to bottom, from really upending them, we can see ways of doing things better that certainly don't cost any more, but solve multiple problems. But yes, we do need more design education, or more relevant design education. And that requires that design be given more credibility in the culture.
That was one of my questions about where can people actually study the kinds of things that you're talking about? So, like, you're a retired professor now, well, not retired, but not teaching actively in universities like you have been for decades. And all of the things that you've been talking about, like, where are these things being taught about? Are they being taught about in architecture schools? Are they being taught about, like, where is net positive design or positive development being talked about?
Well, it's probably not. I mean, people could read my textbooks. My first textbook was really about regenerative design, but it hinted like design for ecosystem services and concepts like that. And it's widely read because it was for undergraduates. My second book, Positive Development, was a postgraduate text read by some. My most recent text, Net Positive Design and Sustainable Urban Development, I don't think is being widely read because it's a dense textbook for overgrads, you might say. But it does give examples of how buildings can provide ecosystem services and work like reefs that support their bioregions. I think I get Google Scholar, and sometimes I've been quoted, and if you click on the button, it'll actually show you the paragraph where you've been cited, and almost every time they've got it completely wrong. You know, and I even read a PhD thesis that quoted what someone else had said about my book that hadn't read it. We've got this problem in academia of Chinese whispers. Academics are so busy having to publish and do myriad other things that they really don't have time to read or engage anymore. That was certainly happening to me in my final years. So I think, I call it the business model. You know, academics suddenly had to produce KPIs. And now academics have wonderful, amazing qualifications. There are all these new award schemes and all these honors that have been created so people can increase their KPIs. And I think many are busy chasing their tails. So they wouldn't know what they wouldn't know what NetPositive design is, for example, because they might throw in a citation, but they haven't actually read it. They don't have time. I'm virtually retired and I don't have time to keep up either. So I have real empathy. And I think we do, there's one step backwards, 2 steps forwards, or vice versa. But I think we need a real shift towards design thinking and towards positive thinking. And what's now seen as positive is what in the 1970s, I think we called cleaner production. There was a shift from remediating toxic sites to cleaner production, but that's 1970s. We're now in a new century, and we have to think about increasing in absolute terms nature and community and equity and justice to make everyone better off. And we can do that through design, but we have to make that shift. And it's not going to happen, I don't think, until, I'm sorry to say, important people say it.
I wanted to...
Let me add that the things grassroots environmentalists were saying 50 years ago were scoffed upon. Now mainstream people are saying those same things, but they're still knocking environmentalists. Not necessarily the same individuals, but society as large is saying, oh, economists are saying this. Why didn't you environmentalists think of that? And a little boy says, but we said it 60 years ago, That's what we're up against. And we have important people like Biden saying, build back better. But at least 50% of the US population can't even take that on board, you see. And that's because, I sound like I'm contradicting myself because it's people, you do have to change people's minds and people vote for politicians and so on. But my point is that that's great what those people are doing to try to educate lay people is wonderful, but we also need more designers that work to improve systems of governance, decision-making, planning, and design.
Yes, thank you. That's a really great call to action, I think. I wanted just to, maybe as a way to kind of wrap up, would be to ask you who or what is providing you with inspiration at this time? Like, is there something that you're seeing that's a new spark of energy in the work that you're doing, or is there some particular inspiration from maybe earlier on that you wanted to point to?
No, I've just always been a nature lover. So everything I've done in my life has been to try to save nature, which would also save people. You can't save people without saving nature. So I can't explain it. But I was just born an optimistic nature lover.
And
I spend at least a couple of hours a day planting things nowadays. So, for my own pleasure.
Edible things, native things, or just a whole mix of?
Just native things. I'm not very sophisticated. I'm just trying to create little biodiversity habitats on my property, which I was too busy to do basically when I was an academic.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time today to chat. I'm going to include all the different links to the references that you've sent me and to all the books. So that's all for today. Thanks so much for joining me. If you like a copy of my top 10 books to read, click the link below, pop in your email, and I'll send it straight to you. You can also watch this interview over on my YouTube channel. I'll put the link below as well. And don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and if you've enjoyed it, please consider giving me a star rating. Believe it or not, the more people do this, the more podcast bots will discover this little podcast. So thanks again, and I'll see you again next week.